Well, it's 3:30 and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for a new webinar series that we've started as part of our Survive and Thrive series. Today, we're going to talk about taking control of cash flow. We're going to be hosting more of these in the future. We'll have another one coming up next month in August. So a few housekeeping items very quickly before we jump in. There is a Q&A bar or a Q&A item in your Zoom bar up at the top. So should you have any questions over the course of our presentation, go ahead and hit that drop down and type your question in. We'll try to get to those at the end. We're going to cover through a lot of material fairly quickly. This is a very impactful area, but hopefully we can make it highly beneficial for you, and certainly excited to be with you here today. My name is Ryan Weissmuller. I am the president of Intrepid Solutions. We partner with entrepreneurial businesses as they navigate the various challenges that come with their evolution over time. And certainly cash flow has been one of those challenges over the last 6 months or so as we've dealt with the economic disruption and the pandemic that we are facing. So lots of real world practical information that we'll share and some stories, and hopefully you'll find this beneficial. So let's dive in. As far as our agenda today, first thing we're going to talk about is just why cash flow matters. And I think that's and specifically cash flow forecasting. That's a really critical piece, and we'll talk about some of the reasons behind that. I thought it was also important just the common objections. We hear a lot of things from clients, from other companies that we come across, some of the reasons why there's flags raised with respect to trying to forecast cash flow. And then we'll really get into the meat of things, which is the best practices, the how-tos. So our goal, again, as always, with everything we try to do, take a practical approach to things. We're in these businesses, we're living it, we're shoulder to shoulder with our clients. We understand a lot of these challenges. We've also seen things work. So our goal is to give you some practical tips, how to make this work for you, how to get cash, how to keep cash, and how to take charge of cash in your business. And then, as I mentioned at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A, hopefully, should anything arrive. But we're going to try, as always, to keep these tight, keep them moving, and be respectful of everybody's time. So first off, let's talk about why, as far as cash flow. Why do it? Why bother? And I think the first and foremost, and again, I'm going to use some old adages, so forgive me, but failing to plan is planning to fail, and cash is no different. One of the best analogies I heard around cash flow was cash is basically if you consider your business to be a car and you're on a long road trip, that cash is really the fuel for your vehicle. And you don't know if a gas station is going to be closed. You don't know how long it's going to be between gas stations. You don't know what that's going to look like along the journey. And if you don't have enough fuel, cash, you're not going to get there where you want to go. So cash is super critical. We've certainly seen a lot of examples during COVID where companies that were forecasting cash prior to the significant impact, let's say in mid-March, were able to look and understand their cash flow position, what changes they need to make very, very quickly, and understand what they could do so that it would ensure cash survivability and some level of stability as well. Companies that didn't do that were really finding themselves scrambling. So again, just super, super critical, that planning element and really being proactive with cash and not reactive. The second piece is just the power of evaluating decisions through the lens of cash. It could be certainly what we saw in the COVID environment was a lot of companies evaluating where to make cuts and understanding the cash impact of that. But certainly, again, as we hopefully are getting ourselves out of the economic disruption in the not too distant future, being able to evaluate investments, being able to evaluate cuts that you need to make elsewhere, or changes in the business if something's underperforming, new hires, bringing people back on, other capital expenditures. Being able to evaluate all those things and what you can do, what you have the margin for error to do, doing that through the lens of understanding the impact on cash is super, super critical. And we have seen firsthand when some of those decisions are made absent that lens. And it can, not always, but it can have some disastrous consequences that quite frankly could be avoided. And then the last piece I will say, and really touching on this a little bit, we've seen it. It works. We have seen it firsthand. And I'll even go back to an example that had nothing to do with the current economic disruption, but we were working with the client and they had never forecasted their cash before. There's some seasonality to their business and also some customer concentration. And when we had just started working with them to help model out their cash flow, we realized that 9 weeks in, they had a $250,000 cash shortfall. And this was about a $5 million business. So not a small number. Because we identified that as early as we did, we had 9 weeks to actually do something proactively about it. We're able to move some pieces around. They actually initiated a kind of a special program to advance some receivables, move some payables around, adjusted some other things. And so from a timing perspective, without raising any additional outside capital, we were able to basically eliminate that $250,000 cash shortfall. Without having that visibility, that wouldn't have been possible. So it works. That's the best thing I can say. It works. So some common objections. And these are things that we have literally heard, might be things that you're thinking in your mind right now or things that your team is thinking. The first one, we can't plan. We can't forecast sales. We can't forecast expenditures. Our business is too fluid, etc. And the simple answer to that is that all businesses have the ability to plan. And really the key, again, is it's about estimates. And so even decent ones are better than no estimate at all. Which takes me to objection number 2. It won't be right. The goal with cash flow planning, forecasting, which is the same with any kind of forecast or plan, is really direction, not perfection. And I think that's something that commonly a lot of companies get held up in, is they're scrutinizing numbers so closely. And don't get me wrong, you don't just want to throw numbers on a piece of paper, but you're going into it knowing you're not going to get it perfect. You want to be close. And what close means is going to vary business by business, but it's not going to be perfect, nor should the goal be perfection. So I'm agreeing, it won't be right, but that doesn't mean don't do it. It means what you're trying to get out of it is different than having everything tied down to the penny. Takes too much time. This is another common one, and I think really a key there is finding a cadence and a balance that works for each business. Certainly, as we're going to talk about, in the early going, you may spend a little bit more time around it. But as time goes on, as things evolve, a lot of businesses only update maybe every couple of weeks, depending on the size. I mean, there are businesses out there that are stable enough that you could theoretically do it once a month. But having that cadence, finding that balance, and as the process evolves, you develop a skill. And honestly, for businesses that we work with and a number that we see, and even just best practices out there, this is not something that once there is a routine established, once there's a cadence, this is not something that takes a significant amount of time for most businesses. And the ROI invested is massive. And then the last one, and this is one that I really want to caution people on, because we have seen this from a number of companies that we've come across, is, well, I look at my bank balance so I know where I am with cash. That is an incredibly risky way of evaluating cash, and there's a couple reasons why. Number one, your bank balance is static. Number two, your bank balance does not reflect checks that could be out there in transit. But the other important thing is just looking at the bank balance removes context. And context is critically important because, let me just use an example there. Your bank balance may look great because a bunch of people paid you early, which means future weeks might be very light. Now that can create a false sense of certainty if all you're doing is looking at your bank balance, and can get you in trouble. So that is one that you have to be very, very careful on. So with that, we've laid some foundation. I'd like to spend the rest of our time here really talking through the how-tos. What do you do? And so we're going to tackle this in a few different categories or buckets, if you will. And then I've actually got an example of a very simplified version that we'll walk through and show that hopefully will illuminate some of these things that we're talking about a little bit more clearly. So first and foremost, and for those of you who have heard some of our other content, you'll know this is a constant theme for us. It is your business. So you have to do the cash flow planning, forecasting, like so many other things, in a way that works for honors, captures your business. And that means it's unique to you in terms of how you look at certain pieces of information or what things really matter. What are the key drivers in your business? What are the key buckets? Your team, your suppliers and the impact there, customers impact there, the types of products, etc. We find it very, very difficult to just have one simple one-size-all format that you can throw out and any company can use. There's always a little bit of customization that's really needed to make this work and work best for each individual business. So some of the basics, and these are what I would say is just a good overall framework, keys, things that you want to make sure that any kind of cash flow plan has. And the first thing we will talk about is the time frame. We like 13-week cash flow. Now, certainly some businesses can run it a lot longer. I've seen businesses that'll try to go 6 months to a year. Shorter and longer, just in our opinion, are not ideal. And here's why. 13 weeks, like I said, that's about 3 months. So if we take our example of that situation where we identified a shortfall 9 weeks out, you want to have visibility at least far enough out where you can actually do something with it. So if you're only looking at your cash flow out a month and you've got a problem 2 months out, you're going to miss it. By the same token, and again, just from what we've found, looking too long of a time horizon down the road, you lose a lot of accuracy and a lot of precision, where there's so many things that can happen that can affect cash. You can still get a very rough directional picture, but that triangulation, no different than the hurricane maps that you see out there. The farther away you are, obviously, the wider that variation can be. And so something just to be careful about. We like 13 weeks, and that's what we suggest and recommend. The second piece is the concept of buckets. And this is important because the goal is not to have a cash flow plan, and you'll see our example here in a few minutes, with 70 line items. Bucket things where you can, group things where possible. And that, again, is going to be really driven by your business, how it's structured, and your financial statements as well. Because there is, you certainly want to have some consistency with the way you're reporting your own financial statements. So that, and the reason for that is you want to be able to actually go back and compare down the road and look. And so if you're pulling completely different buckets that you can't tie anywhere, that's going to pose some problems. So group it, but make sure you group it in a way that makes sense. The third piece is easy to update and really understand the methodology with which you are putting it together. So set up initially, tweak with ease in mind. Sometimes these can get very overcomplicated like everything, but if there is a really clear methodology, and oftentimes notes, these things do not have to be super pretty. It's often healthy to have a note of, this number is here because this customer is paying late and this is what we expect, or we've got a note here because we actually have to pay a deposit to one of our suppliers because of the size of this order. Having that information makes it very, very easy to do two things. To one, go back and really understand where some of the numbers came from, but also, again, to compare to actual, because really what you're doing here, and one of the powers of cash, I talked about it, the timing aspect. From week to week to week, so many things can move that, again, over a longer period of time, even in a P&L, some of that's going to get smoothed out. But from a cash perspective, even if you're going to have a great month, from a cash perspective, a really bad week can be very problematic. So having those notes, having those understanding, being able to compare it to actual is really, really important. And then the last thing that's just really a key best practice is to be conservative. And this is something else that we preach ad nauseum. Being light on inflows and being heavy on outflows. So it's always best to be more conservative on the amount of money you expect, amount and timing of the money you expect to come in. And it's also best to maybe pad a little to the expenses. And again, not to the extreme, but the point here is if you miss on cash flow, you want to miss to the good. What you don't want to be in as a situation is where you miss way high on cash flow and all of a sudden you've got a problem. If you end up with more cash at the end of the week than you were planning, that's rarely a bad thing. Now, if that number's way off, that's a different conversation. But again, if you're doing this right, you should not run into that situation. So let's get into some of the specifics. And really what we like to think about is, cash is all about inflows and outflows, right? What's coming in the door, what's going out the door. But there are some really, really key things to think about, have in the back of your mind as you think through this. On the inflow side, and this is what's really, really important, is the difference between billings and collections. And for many businesses, those are very different. But regardless, the bottom line is, and what's most important, is just understanding how your cash cycle works. There are a lot of businesses out there that certainly have terms with their customers as it relates to their receivables. Could be net 10, net 30, net 45, net 60. There are businesses out there that have a healthy amount of credit card business. Certainly a lot of businesses in the retail space or that support the retail space. Business to consumer businesses are going to have probably a lot of credit card volume, which again, that doesn't mean that's instantaneous. Oftentimes, and again, in our experience, it varies, but there can be a 2 to 5 day lag from the time that a credit card transaction is processed to when that cash actually comes into your bank. So if, for example, you're doing or let's even take Black Friday, that money is probably not showing up till sometime the next week. So if you're planning on that, that can get you in trouble, just factoring that in terms of timing. And certainly there are businesses out there that purely are, maybe they're pay up front, or maybe no services are provided, no money spent, maybe there's no true credit offered of any kind. Again, just understanding that and setting up the inflow side of the cash flow properly up front is really essential. So cannot stress that one enough, getting an understanding of that. And the other thing that I think is key with customer terms. So, and we've run into this a lot. Let's say you have a customer that's got net 30 terms with you. They might actually be paying you in 42 days. When you're forecasting, work off when they're actually paying you, not when they're supposed to pay you. Because if you in your cash flow assume that this customer is paying me every 30 days and they're paying you every 42, you're going to end up light on cash every single week that customer has an invoice, because you're going to be pushing those funds further forward in your projection than they really should be. So now jumping over to the outflows side of things, and very similar on the payables. One of our recommendations is to really look at realistic terms. And I'll say something categorically that I can say on both AR and AP. There are methodologies out there on both accounts receivable and accounts payable, where it may just be that you look over a course of time and just say 10% is going to be paid this week, 20% the next week, 30% the following, then back to 20, and so on until you get to 100%. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that methodology for calculating the inflows and outflows based on accounts receivable and accounts payable, as long as it mirrors what's actually happening in the business. So we find for businesses that aren't terribly consistent, for businesses that have seasonality in a lot of other circumstances, if you actually look at, even if it's grouping accounts receivable and accounts payable, let's say you have 3 main suppliers that have fairly similar profile, looking at actual terms and rolling that out in the cash flow accordingly is oftentimes a best practice. But again, if the percentage works and if that's consistent and if that holds up, that when you go back and compare that against actuals, it looks close, that may well work for you and your business. The next big one, and again, we're just talking about the big categories of outflows, is often payroll. And payroll, good news is it's often predictable in terms of timing, but again, it's so critical because of when that payroll occurs. So many businesses pay every 2 weeks. Some businesses pay twice a month. Some businesses pay weekly, but understanding when that falls, especially in the case of the twice a month, or you're going to have weeks in the every 2 weeks, you're going to have months of the year where you're going to have 3 payrolls. Understanding where that falls, the impact on cash, is super important. So that's really a timing piece, usually an easier number to pin down and define. But there are a lot of businesses out there certainly that have hourly employees where you might just have to take a good average that you're refining over time. And then debt payments. And usually something, again, you're going to have some fixed timing to it. Probably a number that doesn't move around a ton, so you may have to estimate a little bit if, for example, you have a line of credit, or if there's any kind of variable rate debt. But debt payments usually warrants its own bucket, just because that is for many businesses, such a large and such an important payment. Now, you can categorize this in a lot of different ways. Certainly key suppliers. There may be some other expenses for certain businesses. Let's say businesses that are heavy manufacturing or maybe heavy real estate driven. There might be some capital expenditures that are a key category. Might be some other areas that are really impactful, again, just depending on what the business does. Make it work for you. but just thinking about those general categories is what's important. And the other piece that I would say on that is, so let's go back to the example that we just talked about with improvements. Let's say it's a real estate portfolio, or the business is very dependent on real estate assets. It may make sense from a cash flow standpoint to actually, in cases, reserve for big things that pop up. So if you know that roughly every 6 months you might have to invest $50,000 or $100,000 in an asset, it may make sense to save little chunks of that on a monthly basis, and that can be a very, very effective best practice, and certainly something that we'd support. And the last two pieces, really, once all those building blocks are in place, that are super critical as well, is number one, to refine. So getting it all on paper, and I think the most important step, I would say step one, is get it all on paper. And then refine it over the course of 2 or 3 months. See what you learn, compare it to actuals. You know, a best practice that we use with a lot of our clients, especially ones where we're not doing this on a weekly basis, is you might start out doing the first 2, 3, 4 on a weekly basis, but then you're looking to actual and where did we miss? Where are we off? And then you go back and refine, adjust. And over time, you tend to get much, much better at it because you're now aware of those things. So learn from those misses, use that to make the skill better, and it does get much easier. And the last piece, and this is one, again, that I cannot stress enough, especially given the COVID situation that we've been in, is just the power of being able to look at scenarios. And I'll give you some specific examples around this. But you know, when all this hit, we had some customers that were obviously very, very heavily impacted. And they had some key customers themselves that there was real concern about when those customers were going to pay. Because we had a cash flow model in place, because we had a forecast that we could trust, we were actually able to go in that model and move payment back and see, okay, what is the impact if this customer doesn't pay us for 60 days, 90 days, 120 days? What does that do to our cash flow overall? What if all of a sudden, you know, we have some other customers drop off? What if all of a sudden, because of this, some of our suppliers get concerned and start wanting some deposits up front? You're actually able to move some of those pieces around and see the impact. And that is really where the power is. You never want to be doing something like cash flow to say you've done it. You want to be able to do it as a decision-making tool and moving some of those numbers around, seeing the impact, and then deciding, okay, does this mean maybe we need to adjust the timing of our payables a little bit? Does this mean that we can't make that investment that we had planned maybe for another month? We certainly ran into that situation where we had a client that was debating investing in a new ERP system. Obviously, we took that expense and moved it, you know, from a current period to one further down the road for obvious reasons, because you know, the capital wasn't there at the time because of the impact. But again, without being able to see some of that on paper, understand the impact, that's where you get confidence in making decisions. And we've seen that just over and over and over again. So let me run through, and I'll highlight a few things on this, but I think this will be helpful to show as well, is let me show an example. So what you've got on your, and again, this is an example, a snapshot. There's many varieties, many forms of doing this, but what we basically got here is what we would consider a fairly normal 13-week cash flow forecast. You can see beginning cash at the top, the weeks across, ending cash at the bottom, and those are really the two big numbers that you're looking for, is where do we end up? And then broken down, as I suggested when we were going through our best practices, into inflows and outflows. So in this particular business, and what made sense for them, they've got two very large customers. So we actually broke those out separately so we could see the impact. And then other customers below that is basically capturing everyone else. In the outflow section, broken into 3 categories. So labor and production. So really, you know, looking at their payroll, this is a manufacturing business. So the vast majority of their payroll relates to production. So we lumped it all in there. Cost of goods sold. So that's going to be their suppliers and other things that go into that. Overhead, so rent, again, being a manufacturer in a big building, rent is a very large expense for them. Insurance, and then other office expenses, which tend to be more incidental. And believe me, this is simplified, so don't mistake this is exactly what yours should look like. It's just a good example. And then in the bottom case, we have debt, because this company has a bank loan. They have a line of credit, as well as some larger financing. And then they have an equipment loan as well, or an equipment lease, I should say, on some of the equipment in the manufacturing facility. So those are the big buckets. Those are what made sense in their business. Now, what I want to point out here is some key things to look at that will be valuable in terms of in terms of unique items and things to be aware of when you're forecasting cash. So first thing, where you see the red box, is you'll notice that in this particular customer case, and again, this is an objection that we sometimes run into, you can't plan out far enough because you've only got so much accounts receivable. So what we're able to do with this particular instance is the first 5 weeks, those inflows are based on invoices that are expected to be paid. After that, you notice it gets very routine because it was just estimated based on averages and based on conservative averages what is expected to be collected. Not necessarily anything wrong with that. It certainly can be a very good best practice, and you see that number changing and then being consistent as long as the estimate is a pretty close estimate, and that is, again, where something that you can refine as you work through this over time. Next, I want to point out in payroll. And this is something you run into a lot, and you'll notice the timing of this in mid-June. This was quarterly bonuses. So all of a sudden, the payroll was very consistent and then jumps up by $35K because of quarterly bonuses in there. This is something we see all the time, is that bonuses are not estimated often at all or counted on, and that can really be very, very disruptive in a business. If you look at this week, obviously, a big cash flow difference from start to finish, and that bonus has a huge thing to do with it. So certainly in a week where maybe collections are light and you get hit with a heavy payroll, that can cause businesses problems. The next one is looking at cost of goods sold. So just like what we did with the inflows above, with breaking out, going to an estimate after our AR ran out, same thing here. We no longer had invoices, so we guessed what the purchasing was going to be on those items after that 6th week. So you see a steady estimate. Again, refine. It may move from week to week, but just for example purposes here, that's where we left it. And then the other thing to point out is in this particular case, and the danger of one-time items like insurance. So some insurance policies you're only paying once a year. There are other one-time, some quarterly expenses, but things that don't occur every month, things that don't occur like clockwork, being mindful of those because again, those can cause some real cash flow trouble. So with that, let's kind of bring this all together. And again, if there are any questions, we'll try to answer those. I know we're running a little bit close on time here, but a lot to cover, and I wanted to make sure we get through it all. So what are the key takeaways? What do you do with this? The first and foremost thing that we're going to tell you is just do it. There is so much value in it. There is so much risk in not doing it. And it's not as scary as it seems for so many businesses out there for a variety of reasons. And again, we're shoulder to shoulder with these businesses on a routine basis. I get it. It seems daunting, but just do it. The power out of it is unbelievable. It will help you. It will allow you to sleep better at night. Cannot stress that enough. And if there was one thing, oftentimes when we're asked what businesses should do, looking at that cash and managing that cash is often so key, especially in times of disruption like we see right now. There are businesses, for example, that honestly never had to look at cash or haven't had to look in cash in a long time, and then COVID hits, and they don't have the skill set to do it. So it's much easier to have that in place, allows you to weather those storms a little bit more effectively, and something we certainly encourage. The second thing, in terms of a key takeaway, is just really watching that accounts receivable and sales timing. We talked about this. The timing of collections can drive everything. If you've got a big payroll week or a ton of expenditures going out the door, and that big invoice that you were expecting to be paid that they told you was on the way doesn't hit for another week, what do you do? And so being conservative there, being cautious with it, that's something we see that's often a mistake, something to watch really, really carefully, and something we'd suggest. The third is watching out for those one-time gotchas. I brought up the insurance example. There can be a number of things like that, and in every business, there are non-routine expenses that pop up. Could be an investment in something. It could just be things you're paying once a year, quarterly, like I said. Really being mindful of those, maybe an annual bonus even. Being mindful of those, making sure you've accounted for those, that's really, really critical. Learning from the practice, and I brought this up, practice makes perfect, just like my mom said. It's true in this case, and I don't want to make light of it, but it is about sharpening the saw, getting in there. You get better, you get some feel, and we have seen firsthand a number of situations where companies started out, those first few might be really ugly. Those first few might have some people pulling their hair out, but it works. And we've seen even the most hardened and insistent of businesses that it wasn't going to work. We've seen them make tremendous progress. So it works, it's doable, and you can get better. And then the last piece, I talked about this with the scenarios, developing that comfort zone, really understanding the key areas of focus. This is a decision-making tool at the end of the day. This is ultimately what this is there to do, to help the leadership team, to help the CEO, to help the owner make a good decision based on the information in front of them and based on the assumptions that are going into it. So what are the key areas to watch? Again, to use another example, we had a client that was looking at making a number of cuts when COVID hit. And kind of going down the list, they were focused in some areas that actually, when you remove those out of the cash flow forecast, weren't having that much of a material impact. So understanding what are the areas that really drive cash, what are the things that you can influence. Companies are often shocked by even just getting certain customers to pay a day, 2, 3 days early, how much of an impact that can actually have in cash flow over time. It can be massive. So understanding where to really focus energy, eyes, scrutiny, understanding what the desired cushion looks like in your business and what you're searching for. And then knowing the pieces that you need to or can move around as time goes on. For customers, and certainly this happened a lot during the COVID fallout, of having conversations with vendors, and I need to push this out another week, 2 weeks. Knowing where you have the ability to do that, understanding those levers, super critical, super important. So with that is all the prepared content we've got. I know, we tried to really capture a lot of feedback and input ahead of time on what were the big struggles out there in the market. So I know I addressed some questions ahead of time. I don't see anything else in the Q&A box, which is good because we're 2 minutes over. So I appreciate your patience, appreciate you hanging on with us. Certainly, you have my information up on the screen. If you do have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We do record these like all our webinars, and we'll be posting it. So if you ever want to watch this again, or if there's something you missed. And as I mentioned, we'll have some other content here next month, and we're going to keep adding to this and hopefully giving you some tools that you're able to walk away with and allow you to sleep a little bit better at night in your business. So thank you for joining us. That was a crash course in cash flow. Get out there, make it work for you. Stay safe, stay strong, and thank you so much for joining us. Take care.